Can you say your last name, or first name, last name, and middle initial and spell it?
Everett Markway, and middle initials H. I am a junior, and Everett's Everett, Markway, Markway.
All right. What year were you born in?
I was born in 1945, a couple days after VJ Day, the end of World War II.
Can you tell us about your family?
Well, my dad served in World War II in the Marine Corps in the Pacific, and my mother was a secretary, and eventually after the war he worked as a postal clerk here in Jefferson City.
Did you have any siblings?
I had two brothers, one Ron that was 11 months younger, and then a younger brother Rick that was 12 years younger.
Where did you live when you became part of the military?
Well, I was living in Jefferson City when I got drafted, and of course went to Fort Leonard Wood eventually for basic training.
Okay. When you graduated from high school, where did you graduate and in what year?
I graduated from Helias High School in 1963.
What branch of service were you a part of?
The U.S. Army.
Did you choose that branch, or was that what you were drafted into?
I was drafted into that branch.
How did you come about getting into the service? Were you volunteered or drafted?
I was drafted. Before I was drafted, I did take physical and mental tests at Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis, and also went before an oral interview board at University of Missouri in Columbia before ROTC officers to get accepted into the Army's Officers Candidate School, which I was. And then after that, I was drafted and went to Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis and went through the testing and went into the service at that time in January of 1969.
How was the draft working at the time when you were drafted?
Well, it was a number system, and everybody of draftable age, if you were selective service over 18, you had a draft number, and I had a low number, so I knew I would be drafted. Others that had higher numbers, based on the information in the media at the time, they knew they may or may not be drafted, so they made their decision accordingly.
How did your family feel about you joining the military?
I'm sure it's mixed feelings. My dad, again, served in the South Pacific, World War II. He obviously saw difficult conditions, and but there was also pride there too. I had 3 uncles on my mother's side and 3 uncles on my dad's side served in World War II, so it was, kind of accepted that you would serve.
Where did you attend basic training?
At Fort Leonard Wood, which is near St. Roberts, Missouri, in southern Missouri.
It is said that in basic training the individual is broken and the serviceman is created. Do you agree with this?
To a certain extent, because I remember thinking in my own mind, well, they have my body, but they don't have my mind. But then I was like 24 years old. I wasn't a 17-year-old idealistic young man. I'd been through college, and so I knew what to expect to a certain extent.
What are some of the stories you remember from basic training during that time?
Well, the very first night, we were on a bus from St. Louis after we passed our physicals and were sworn into the service, went on I-44 all the way to Fort Leonard Wood. By the time we got our gear, clothing, and all that, it was after midnight, and the drill sergeant marched us into an old wooden World War II barracks and set up fire guards for the night. Every hour somebody had to walk through the halls and everything to make sure there wasn't any fire. It's a wooden barracks. As it turned out, the furnace wasn't working that night, and it got down to 20 degrees, and that was the coldest night I ever spent.
Do you remember any of your instructors specifically?
Yes, there was one instructor. He came from Vietnam. He was in the Air Cav division on a helicopter. He got shot, and he was wounded, but he served as a platoon sergeant, drill sergeant, and he seemed to have a more even keel about himself than some other sergeants.
Do you have any like favorite memory from basic training, like a highlight?
Well, highlight would be, I think with most trainees in basic training, is the rifle range and being able to qualify on the rifle range. One of the other highlights, you might say, was bayonet training. The instructors, of course, informed us that the Marines at Khe Sanh in Vietnam were overrun by Viet Cong, and they had to use bayonets in hand-to-hand combat. So that got everybody's attention and say, hey, this is for real here, so we better pay attention.
How long does basic training last?
It was 8 weeks. I went from middle of January to the end of March.
And then what year did you finish?
That would have been 1969.
When basic training was over, did you have a chance to return home, or were you immediately sent to an assignment?
I was able to go on leave for a short time, came back to Jefferson City where my wife had an apartment with a friend of hers, and then I was sent directly to Fort Detrick in Maryland, which is the U.S. Army's Biological Research Center. It's a special, it was through a special classification system for science and engineering graduates. You would go directly to your duty assignment rather than going through what's called AIT, Advanced Individual Training, which most soldiers went there to learn more infantry tactics and have advanced training. So I went directly to Fort Detrick from my leave.
Do you think that you were put in the right position when you were sent to Fort Detrick?
Yes, I was pleasantly surprised because, as I mentioned earlier, I'd passed my OCS qualifications and I could have gone to Officers Candidate School. But as I found out, the practicality of the situation was in Vietnam, infantry officers were needed. And I wanted to go into the Chemical Corps to use my experience. I knew that probably wasn't going to happen, so after basic training, or just before the end of basic training, I found out that I was going to Fort Detrick, and that it was a lab, and I would be working in a lab in the United States. So I took that as an enlisted man rather than going as an officer.
What do you remember being taught during advanced training, as far as just like more advanced stuff that you learned about chemistry?
Yes, I had two researchers I worked with. One was an Englishman, a more formal gentleman, and he wasn't very forthcoming. He was very to the point, and I didn't get a lot of information from him, but I worked for him in a technical role. But the second officer, he had his PhD in biophysics from the University of Washington, a young officer, and he was very up to date with scientific background, and I learned a lot from him, and he gave me a lot of latitude, and that was very helpful for me.
Oh, what specific things did you work on in the chemistry field?
At Fort Detrick, we were working in our particular lab. It's a physical science lab, a separate building from some of the other labs. We were working on very basic fundamental research on cell membranes, and I got a chance to work with a particular instrument called a spectrophotometer and doing some analysis and research on cell membranes and how they interact and how they work, so that in the biological warfare area, that's what happens in some of those cases with germ warfare, if you call it. You need to know what's happening and how to counteract that. So at that time, the Army was in a defense mode. No more offensive weapons were being produced. We were only trying to figure out the enemy and how to counteract what they could provide.
So you were in the military during the Vietnam period, but your work wasn't directly focused on the Vietnam War. It was more focused on a broader area. What do you think that your work was focused on outside of that?
Well, I think my work, again, was fundamental research. It wasn't applied research, although I did have some friends, soldier friends of mine, that did work on some applied research in a different lab there, where they were trying to quickly identify bacteria in air samples to counteract biological warfare immediately, rather than trying to culture some bacteria in auger plates and waiting 24, 48 hours to figure out what it was.
Did you receive any promotions while you were working?
Yes, I went through a Specialist 4, and then Specialist 5 was my last promotion.
From your time in service, could you give 4 or 5 things that you remember vividly even today?
Oh, yes. I already mentioned the basic training, although one of the things that really stuck out in my mind in basic training was near the end of the training, of course, we had to bivouac out on near the rifle range. And of course, this is the winter time, and it snowed overnight. We had to set up our tents and sleeping bags. We had to dry shave with water out of your helmet, you know, and then we had to, of course, qualify on the rifle range and then march back, which was like 7 miles back to the barracks through muddy, sloshy roads, and you know, had big boots on. And it was a very vigorous, hard march to get back. So that's the basic training. But at Fort Detrick, there were several things that stand out. One is during this period of time, there were anti-war demonstrations in Washington, D.C., and we had our demonstration at our front gate because we were about 45 miles from D.C. Well, we had a very small MP, military police force, so us draftees mainly, us scientists, were the backup for the MPs. So they called us out on Memorial Day weekend, ruined our holiday. We had to stay in a day room fully geared up. We had a rifle, gas mask, and all that stuff. They didn't provide ammo. That was probably good. But the situation at that time was that several months before, National Guardsmen in Kent State and Ohio fired on anti-war students and killed some of them. So this was going through our mind. What are we going to do? We had been trained in riot control methods, but when push comes to shove, what's going to happen? So luckily, they didn't break through the lines at the front gate and didn't try to get in the base. So we, were called off duty for that.
Can you remember any of the names of the people you served with?
Yes, there was another instance at Fort Detrick. Some of my best friends, Steve McLean, Murray Swartz, Bill Ekblad, they were soldiers like myself, scientists, drafted. But we became friends when I lived in the barracks as a single enlisted man before my wife came, because she was teaching school, and the timing was I had to spend a couple of months in the enlisted barracks, and then we lived off base in off-base housing. But these guys, we got together one Christmas, it was Christmas of '69, and got needy families taken care of with, we had canned food drives and presents and things like that. It was very interesting because Murray Swartz eventually became a medical doctor. He was Jewish from Philadelphia. He served in the Peace Corps, and he played Santa Claus. And I remember going into a farm where they had a milk parlor made into a housing for this single mother and her kids. And we walked in there, and it just was amazing. The kids were excited, and so that made a big deal. And out of that, we received letters of commendation from the commander of our fort.
How was the process of you like living in the barracks and then moving into housing with your wife?
Well, when I first got there, it was, let's see, that would be, say, the 1st of April. My wife taught to May, middle of May or towards the end of May. So in that time period, I had to house myself in the single enlisted men's barracks. And that was good in a way because I got to know the other soldiers there, and then eventually our wives and others, and we made a nice family away from home type situation. So then I, of course, I arranged to get off-base housing just outside the back gate of the Fort Detrick, and it was a housing complex, fairly nice, and other military families, young married people, and we became friends. We played volleyball. We off-duty hours, we had fun together.
How long did you serve in the military?
2 years.
What was the reason for you to get discharged?
I served my time as that was as a draftee. You served 2 years. If you enlisted, you had to serve at least 4 years.
Can you explain what was going on overseas during your time serving?
Well, as I alluded to, the Marines in Quezon, there was the height of the battle going on in Vietnam. And of course, American military is trying to hold back the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, and the South Vietnamese government was not up to the task. Some of their forces were good, their Marines were good, but that was a situation eventually, because of the lack of the will of the people of South Vietnam, that it fell to the communists.
You mentioned that you were stationed very close to Washington, D.C. Did you ever travel into Washington, D.C. during your time there?
Off-duty times, we traveled into D.C. I had a sister-in-law that served in the Air Force at the Pentagon, and she invited us down. We got a tour of the Pentagon one July 4th weekend, and in the evening we sat out on the steps of the Pentagon and watched the fireworks go off into the air and reflecting in the reflecting pool there. So that was impressive, among other things. One of the things I wanted to mention too is that I served in the Honor Guard while I was in the military at Fort Detrick. And of course we did military parades on July 4th in Baltimore, but what really affected me were the funerals that we did, and in particular a black soldier that died in Vietnam, and it was a rural black church, and they had an ambulance outside, they had nurses. There was a lot of emotion, a lot of something I wasn't aware of, and even though I went to Lincoln University and in a mixed racial setting, I wasn't prepared for that type of emotion that took place. And of course we had burials of other older veterans and young Caucasian veterans, but that really made a big impression on me.
What exactly is the Honor Guard?
The Honor Guard consists of, it's about 10 men. Generally, as far as a military funeral, you'll have guys with the rifles firing the volleys, you'll have a bugler, and you'll fold the flag. And of course we also lead in parades of our military forces on base if we had reviews by higher ranking officers.
What do you remember the most about your time in the service?
I guess probably like most veterans, you remember the people that you became friends with. Again, it was like family, and you know, they alluded to brotherhood and things like that. That does happen, and even though I wasn't in combat, we were away from home, away from friends. It wasn't, you didn't have the internet, you didn't have cell phones, you had limited contact with family by letters or expensive long-distance phone calls. So you became very close in that way. That was the big experience.
Okay. What qualities do you believe you carried from military to where you are today?
Well, I think you understand people a little bit better. Living in mid-Missouri and maybe a limited, diverse culture, even though I went to Lincoln, I got the chance to see all socioeconomic people, various races and ethnic varieties, and you understand people are people, and they just want to be who they are, and that sort of thing. So that was my best experience. Plus, you know, of course, organizational, being on time, and that sort of thing helps in the workaday world.
When you were transferring out of the military, how did that transition go from working as a chemist in the military to what you did afterwards?
Well, of course, that was another thing. As far as being able to get back home, you to get a military discount, you had to wear your uniform. And so I flew out of Baltimore to St. Louis, and at that time, military was not well thought of. You really didn't want to wear your uniform in the civilian secular world because people didn't understand. You know, they're baby killers and all that stuff. You may get spit on, you may get cussed out. So you didn't have the support. But anyway, once I got back home, luckily I found a classmate just by accident. I was shopping in a store, and he said, "Hey, there's a chemist position available at the Missouri Highway Patrol Crime Lab." And sure enough, I got hired there, and 31 years later I retired from that lab.
Do you ever get back together with the people you served with?
Not personally, although we do by Christmas cards. That's mainly what we do.
How did your time in the military affect your life afterwards?
Well, that is really hard to say because, again, I wasn't in combat, so it was more like you have your fatigues on, you show up for formation in the morning, you go to your workplace, you put your lab coat on and go to work. But it affected me, again, like I said, because of the variety of people I met. Steve McLean was Tex-Mex, so to speak, from Austin, Texas. He was a geochemist. Murray Swartz went on to become a medical doctor. Bill Ekblad was a microbiologist and eventually ended up in Idaho. All these different people and their situations, we had good off-duty hours together. So that's, it just helped in, I guess you might say, your social skills of dealing with a variety of people in later life.
Was there a smooth transition from you from like being discharged from the military back into like your everyday life, or was it just different?
Relatively smooth. Again, I didn't have to survive very harsh combat conditions, so it wasn't that hard for me to make that transition.
You mentioned that you came from a military family. What exactly did your parents, or if your siblings served, what did they do in the military?
Okay, as I mentioned, I had 3 uncles on my dad's side that served in the military in World War II. 2 of them were in the Navy, 1 in the Army. And on my mom's side, there were 2 in the Army and 1 in the Navy. And so that was my background. As far as my younger brother, Ron, he did go for a physical, but I think he had a medical condition, so he wasn't accepted. And of course, Rick was too young for the war at that time for the draft.
What was the best part of basic training?
The best part of basic training was, again, being with the people. There were some, like one in particular, a guy that was just, he was going to be a top-notch soldier, but he had a good level head on his shoulders, and he was picked as the best recruit out of the basic training. And he, you know, he was a leader type, and he probably was going to be in special forces or something like that. But then on the other side of the coin was this sad sack guy, this hillbilly from southern Missouri. He had 2 left feet, but the guy tried. He really tried, and the drill sergeants recognized that. And it was something.
Is there any other stories you want to add from your time?
Well, my first child, my daughter Laura, was born while I was in the Army at the local hospital, and that was an extreme experience for me. I got a chance to be in the delivery room when she was born, and I had worked at the officers club as a bartender in my off-duty hours to make money. You know, I was a poor enlisted man, and so I didn't get to go to the birthing classes and all that stuff that was so-called required for a person to be in the delivery room. But I talked to the doctor saying I'm a scientist, and he said, well, I don't need another patient. I don't want somebody collapsing here and have to deal with that. I said, no, I won't. So we were in there after Laura was born and talking. I was talking to the doctor, and he's working on my wife and everything. We're talking about baseball and baseball scores and things like that. But that was quite an emotional experience, and even though it didn't have anything to do with the military other than I was there, that was quite something.
What was the hardest part of the military lifestyle for you to adapt to?
It's not so much the military lifestyle as being away from my wife. I was married only about 1.5 years, and here we had to separate. And then, of course, through basic training, I didn't know if I was going to go to Vietnam. I didn't know if they were going to put me in a field I hoped to be in. I had a chemistry professor in college that served in the Korean War. He was an organic chemistry professor, and the closest he came to organic stuff was driving a fuel truck in Korea. So that's one reason I looked at OCS and thinking I want to serve, but I want to serve where I can be of best help to the military.
How did you stay in touch with your family and your friends while you were serving?
Basically letters. Of course, with my wife, they had us writing letters just about every day in basic training, and that's what happened later, or letters and a few long-distance phone calls, but you didn't use your phone very much.
Do you remember any like funny stories or humorous things that happened to you during your time?
Oh, well, I don't know if it's so humorous, but it's just a simple thing. You're deprived of so much when you go from the civilian world into basic training. You know, basically you're deprived of somewhat of your freedom. You know, you just don't walk off the base. They got you, and food and all that other stuff. So one time we had some temporary duty. I don't know what it was, but we were out on a truck, and the sergeant let us stop at a PX and go in and buy something. I bought a pack of gum. Pack of gum tasted like nothing else in the world at that time because it wasn't the bland Army food. So little things.
Do you recall the day your service ended?
Yes. Of course, had to go through processing out of the Fort Detrick, and there were all kinds of offices to go through. But then getting on the plane and flying back home, because my family had already, let's see, no, I didn't fly back home. My family had driven, my wife and daughter had driven home from Frederick to Jefferson City, so I had to fly back. And that's, I recall, flying back home and being happy about that.
How was the attitude when you got home to Jefferson City? How did, just in general, how did the city feel about military people at that time?
I think I didn't feel any hostility in Jefferson City itself, but it was kind of indifference. I mean, you're back, okay, life goes on.
How did your family feel to have you back?
Of course, they're happy and thrilled that I was back, and so there were a number of men that didn't come back from Vietnam, and of course you can have train accidents too, and you don't have to be overseas in the combat area. I remember we went through some live fire exercises in basic training, at least they said it was, and you're at night, you're crawling under barbed wire, and they have machine guns firing over your heads, and they have explosions going around. And they were controlled, of course, but we didn't know that, and they were trying to make it as realistic as possible. So he didn't want you to stand up, because
did the GI Bill support your education at all, or did you join too late for that?
GI Bill did help later on. When I was in the crime lab, had an opportunity to take some courses at Lincoln at night, but also there was a master's program that came from Warrensburg. Central Missouri State had a master's in criminal justice administration. They brought instructors down to Jefferson City at the high school, so we went through classes at night and through the summer. In a year and a half, I had a master's degree through my GI Bill, and I saved that money since I was working 40 hours a regular job. I did this in my off hours, so I saved that money and eventually used it as down payment for a house.
Are you a part of a veteran organization?
Not really, because most of them, if you serve overseas, like the VFW, American Legion, and that, you have to be out of the States to be a member. So the closest I can come to that is the Knights of Columbus. 4th degree is a patriotic degree, and I'm actually on an honor guard for that. But that's not technically a veterans organization.
What do you do on that honor guard?
We do wakes for our members. We don't do the military funeral as the military does, but we at any times that the bishop has a ceremony such as confirmation or ordination of priests or deacons, we're there to provide an honor guard for that occasion.
Have you attended any reunions, or like not specifically with the people you serve, but just service members in general?
No, I haven't. I haven't had that opportunity because after you consider your friends in that particular location of Fort Detrick, you're not as close to other military. I have gone to Bugle Day, Bugle Boy occasions a couple of times, and also went on an honor flight to DC to see the war memorials.
What are some life lessons that you've learned from your service?
Again, it's how to work with diverse populations, how to deal with people, how to stay organized, on time, get projects completed, that sort of thing.
how has the military service impacted your feelings?
Well, of course, I tend to be a moderate conservative, you might say. Of course, believe in, of course, protecting the Constitution and the national security of this country, and wanting to make sure that this country is safe and secure for children, grandchildren, and future generations.
What is there a message you'd like to leave for future generations, or just anything?
Well, don't forget the veterans. Don't forget the people that served in the military. There's a program at Christmas time where they put wreaths on the soldiers' graves at the National Cemetery here in town. That's something that young people are doing, and projects like this and veterans coming into history classes and talking to people. Remember the veterans. Remember that freedom doesn't come cheap. There's a cost to freedom, and that's to have the military there to protect the security of the country.
What do you want people to know more about veterans in general?
Again, it's to remember the veterans, remember what they've done, the sacrifices they've gone through, not just the veterans themselves, but their families too. And I'm glad to see more support for the families that are left behind, the wives and the children, and trying to help them deal with the separation with their loved ones. And I recognize that separation when I was in the military.
So you talk about the separation there. Was it hard to raise your first child when you were still in the military?
Well, I didn't have a lot of time. Like I said, I was in the military, I had my regular duties there, and then I worked at the Officers Club to try to save some money, because I knew I'm coming out of the military, but I don't know what I'm going to be going into. We didn't make that much money, and so it left premium on time, but I still remember changing diapers and reading to Laura and things like that, and we did the usual things that parents do.
While you were at Fort Detrick, what was life like?
Well, it was actually pretty darn good. Anytime you have guys or gals in the military, they're going to complain about what's going on, But actually, deep down, I lived in Frederick, Maryland, off base. It's about 45 miles from D.C. It's near the Catoctin Mountains. It's western Maryland. It's a lot like where I came from, around Jefferson City. It has horse farms. It's got green countryside, and the people there, German American, basically, and so it wasn't that big a change from Jefferson City.
Did you know anyone specifically that served overseas in Vietnam?
Yes, there were some classmates below me and a classmate of mine that both of those guys were in the Marine Corps, and they got wounded in Vietnam, and I think it shortened the life of one of them, and one of my classmates still around, but he was luckily he was saved by his teammates. He was wounded a couple of times trying to be evacuated. So yes, there were some that I knew over there, and some served as officers too.
Did you hear any stories about the Vietnam War while you were back at Fort Detrick?
We were a little bit isolated there at Fort Detrick. We were concentrating on our mission. We're a bunch of scientists, veterinarians, and medical doctors doing research on animals and in the test tubes and all of that. So we were concentrating on our mission there, even though we had demonstrators at the front gate at times, and you did read the paper a little bit, but that was about it.
Well, is there any just final thoughts you'd like to add, or final stories you want to make sure recorded?
Well, I wrote a few things down, but I'm not going to go into a lot of that. Basically, we received military training at Fort Detrick in the afternoons, Friday afternoons, and So we had to keep up with our PT. We had PT, annual PT tests and rifle qualifications. We had to go through gas chamber with gas mask and all that stuff. We did riot control drills because of the potential for that. That pretty well covers it. One thing I wanted to mention too, in basic training, of course, you had Sunday mornings and you could go to church. Well, I think some guys went to church because they got out of the boring routine in the barracks kind of thing, but others didn't. And I went to Mass at the base chapel there, and I remember I've never seen and heard such enthusiasm in a Mass by men singing. They knew that some of them wouldn't survive this war. At that point, I didn't know if I was going to. But it was great to see the faith there exhibited.